Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243, which was operated by an Embraer 190, was apparently shot down by Russian anti-aircraft ordnance, but that's only the beginning of the story. I'm Stan, a former Embraer 190 instructor and check airman and a current 737 captain, and I'm here to explain what happened next. The first part of the story doesn't have anything to do with the crash itself, but rather the history of civilian jets being shot down accidentally over war zones. The most recent example was on January 8th of 2020 when Iranian armed forces shot down Ukraine Airlines Flight 742 approximately 5 minutes after the Boeing 737-800 took off from Tehran Imam Khomeini Airport destined for Kyiv, Ukraine. All 176 occupants were killed. The backstory for this crash and the reason why Iranian forces were on high alert was fallout from the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani by an American drone strike near Baghdad International Airport a week prior. Soleimani was targeted due to accusations that his Quds force had been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American service members and the woundings of thousands more. Soleimani was a consigliere to Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, and the Iranian hierarchy did not take kindly to his killing. On January 8th, the same day that Ukraine Airlines Flight 742 was shot down, Iran had fired missiles at 2 air bases located in Iraq, which housed U.S. forces. This represented the first known direct engagement between Iran and the U.S. since the naval battle which preceded the Vicens incident in 1988, an incident which resulted in the accidental shootdown of Iran Air Flight 655 by the American Navy, who had mistaken the airliner for an Iranian F-14 Tomcat, who they believed were lining up to attack the Navy ships who were engaged in a shooting battle with small Iranian vessels. The Airbus A300 was carrying 290 people, all of whom perished. The crash would inflame tensions between the U.S. and Iran, with a yearly day of remembrance memorializing the simmering hostilities between the two nations ever since. Sandwiched between these two tragedies was Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, which was shot down by Russian-backed separatists over eastern Ukraine on July 17th of 2014. The Boeing 777-200ER was carrying 283 passengers and 15 crew members. All 298 occupants perished. Russian media outlets initially claimed that separatist forces had shot down a Ukrainian Air Force AN-26 before abruptly changing course and blaming Ukrainian armed forces for shooting the airliner down. Now, international courts ultimately determined that the aircraft was shot down by separatists who were controlled by Russian military leaders and who had been supplied the anti-aircraft missiles and launchers from Russian stockpiles. The crash was the end of a terrible year for Malaysia Airlines. 8 months prior, spectacularly, another Boeing 777 had disappeared over the Indian Ocean and has never been found. Zip forward a decade, and once again it appears that a conflict between Russia and Ukraine has spilled over into an anti-aircraft attack on a civilian airliner. According to multiple reports, at the time that Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243 was fired on by Russian forces, multiple Ukrainian drones were flying over the southwestern part of the country. Adding confusion to the situation, Flight 8243 was reported to have attempted 2 approaches to the intended destination of Grozny, one of the Russian cities purportedly targeted by the Ukrainian drones. The pilots were apparently unable to land due to a combination of fog and Russian use of electronic scrambling equipment, which was intended to disrupt the navigational capabilities of the Ukrainian drones, but can also disrupt airline navigational systems as well. Earlier reports indicate that Flight 8243 attempted to divert to another airport due to their troubles landing at Grozny. This, unfortunately, led to the Azerbaijan Airlines Embraer 190 flying some 200 miles off its original filed flight plan. Information still raw and prone to change, although Putin has already more or less admitted to the mistake in an apology to the Azerbaijan people. But for now, it looks like Flight 8243, unable to land at Grozny, wound up off course over Russia during a Ukrainian drone strike. Clearly, communication channels between civilian air traffic controllers and military anti-aircraft commanders was insufficient, resulting in the targeting of the Embraer 190. This situation was similar both to the Vincennes incident off the Iranian coast, where the Iranian Airlines flight had been running behind schedule, and the shootdown of Ukraine Airlines over Tehran, where communications between the anti-aircraft operators and the civilian air traffic controllers was clearly inadequate, with the two entities utilizing incompatible frequencies and thus unable to coordinate. And now that we're all caught up in the tangled web that ties these four civilian airline tragedies together, let's talk about what exactly it was that brought down Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243 some 2 miles short of a suitable runway on the shore of the Caspian Sea. The first and most obvious observation has to do with the damage that exists on the tail of the aircraft. Surface-to-air missiles are designed to track designated targets and fly towards them, but not to actually strike them. Proximity fuses in the missiles are designed to detonate at an optimal distance from the aircraft and to shower it with high-velocity debris that ultimately destroys the ability of the aircraft to fly. It should be obvious, but an airliner possesses no defensive capabilities against a missile. Not only is an airliner not very maneuverable, but it does not possess any electronic monitoring to inform pilots when they have been fired on. And civilian pilots are not trained to visually detect or respond to incoming missiles. The short of it is, an airliner is a fish in a barrel for a surface-to-air missile. Now, perhaps Russian forces fired a dud, or perhaps the never-ending war in Ukraine has forced accelerated munitions manufacturing that has compromised quality control standards. Whatever the case, though the missile did damage the jet airliner, it did not do nearly as much damage as it should have. Fortunately for the survivors of the flight, the soft target Embraer 190 remained in flying shape after the missile seemingly exploded somewhere along the right aft of the aircraft. Video from the ground depicts a wallowing flight path towards a forced landing in a field just past the shore of the Caspian Sea. After striking the ground, the aircraft split into at least two parts. The forward section burst into flames, while the aft section eventually came to a rest upside down. Investigators have yet to release details, but likely all the survivors were in the aft section of the aircraft. The fact that the aircraft burst into flames indicates the presence of fuel on board. Likewise, the flight path does not appear to represent an aircraft that's gliding. Still, with the damage to the tail of the aircraft, it remains possible that the fuel tanks, which are in the aircraft wings, were damaged, and that leaking fuel limited the supply available to the pilots to divert to a suitable runway. It could also help explain the seeming panic maneuver where a steep bank preceded the crash. The pilots clearly believed that a forced landing on a field was their only option and maneuvered aggressively in order to get the aircraft down. Whatever the case, it is clear that the aircraft had at least some fuel on board at the time of impact. Given the apparent missile damage on the aircraft, a great deal of which was located towards the tail on both the vertical and horizontal stabilizers of the aircraft, there is a possibility that all three hydraulic systems in the Embraer 190 were damaged. All three of these systems feed into the aircraft empennage to control the rudder and the elevators, which are located on the aft portion of the vertical and horizontal stabilizers. Plumbing for these hydraulic systems crisscrosses the back of the aircraft, and if debris fragments penetrate the pipes, hydraulic fluid, which is pressurized to 3,000 psi, will quickly be depleted, rendering the hydraulic system inert. One of the more famous accidents in the history of aviation occurred following a catastrophic failure of the tail-mounted engine on a DC-10 operating as United Airlines Flight 232 on July 19, 1989. A fan disc on the tail-mounted engine disintegrated in flight, resulting in high-velocity shrapnel being expelled into the tail section of the aircraft. The shrapnel penetrated all three of the 500,000-pound aircraft's hydraulic systems.
Movement. Lost them. No, we have no hydraulic fluid. That's part of our main problem. What's the hydraulic quantity? No, zero. Quantity's gone. Yeah, all quantity's gone. Radar contact.
Okay, so you know we have almost no controllability. Very little elevator and almost no aileron. We're controlling the turns by power.
United 232 Heavy, understand, sir. You can only make right turns?
That's affirmative.
After all hydraulic fluid was lost, the crew could no longer control the aircraft with the traditional flight control surfaces. The forces required to muscle a 500,000-pound aircraft are impossible without hydraulic assistance. The crew ultimately managed to control heading and turns by applying differential thrust on the two remaining wing-mounted engines. 184 of the 296 occupants survived the ensuing crash landing. Investigators later marveled at the ability of the crew to maneuver the stricken aircraft to Sioux Gateway Airport in Sioux City, Iowa, where it was possible to rescue at least some of the passengers following the inevitable crash. While the DC-10 was not manufactured with operable flight controls in the event of a total loss of hydraulic systems, the 60,000-pound Embraer 190 does have a couple of backups. The ailerons, which pilots use to bank the aircraft, have a mechanical reversion mode. The horizontal stabilizer is powered by electrical motors, allowing the pilots limited control over the aircraft's trimmed airspeed. But the elevators, which allows the pilots to directly control the pitch and attitude of the aircraft, are fly-by-wire, which means that pilot inputs to the yoke are sent to a computer for processing, and from there to hydraulic actuators, which command the position of the control surfaces. Without hydraulics, the pilots cannot directly control aircraft pitch. But all airliners are designed to be stable, returning to a neutral pitch attitude following displacement without any pilot or control surface input. Still, it does not do this rapidly. Instead, it porpoises, or using aviation jargon, it experiences phugoid oscillations in a period of 30 to 60 seconds. In plain language, the aircraft gradually alternates between lazy nose-up and down movements, exactly the kind that are seen in ground video and radar data from the accident flight. I have personal experience with a total hydraulic failure in jet aircraft in a simulator. I've twice been at the controls during a simulated total failure of the hydraulic systems. First, in a CRJ 200 simulator with no pitch or roll control, and then in the Embraer 190 simulator, which did have roll control but no elevator. In the less maneuverable CRJ 200, I was able to get the aircraft on the ground using differential thrust and horizontal stabilizer trim. In the Embraer 190 sim, which was configured as an Embraer 175, the same type of aircraft but just a little bit smaller, I was able to control bank via manual control reversion on the yoke, but were unable to control the descent rate, ultimately resulting in a crash. The point here, from my experience, is that this is a very difficult maneuver whose success is as much a matter of luck as it is skill, particularly if you're not trained repetitively on it, which no pilot is. The flight track data depicts the aircraft generally aligned with the runway at Act 2 Airport before going around first in a left and then a right circle. It was at the end of this right circle that cell phone footage from the ground captured the final moments of the flight. I should mention here that the landing gear is controlled by hydraulics also, but can be extended in the event of hydraulic failure by a combination of gravity freefall and aerodynamic loads. It's important to understand that this emergency extension is just that, extension only. You can't retract the gear without hydraulic fluid. Likely they extended the gear in preparation for the first attempt to the runway. It's also important to understand that adding or reducing thrust on the wing-mounted engines can produce significant pitch changes to the aircraft. This is because the engines are mounted below the center of gravity of the aircraft, so an increase in thrust pushes the nose up, while a decrease results in it falling towards the earth. Under normal conditions, the flight control computers in the Embraer 190 automatically compensates for this, adding or subtracting elevator in order to keep the aircraft in trim, which is to say to make the aircraft easier for pilots to fly. Now, these computers wouldn't have been active with the hydraulics out of service.
We found that in order to stop a phugoid, you had to do just the opposite of what you would normally do. As the speed built up, you had to actually add power to pitch up. And the hardest thing to do, though, was as the nose started up and started to slow down, and you're approaching a stall, you had to close the throttles. An airplane wants to fly its trim speed.
And when the pilots decided to abort their initial approach and go around, they would have added a great deal of thrust. In combination with the already uncontrollable pitch oscillations, the 190 at this point would have become more roller coaster than airplane. Likely the pilots, in the moment, didn't understand what was going on. To them, it would have felt like the aircraft was out of control, getting worse and worse. You can understand their impulse to get it on the ground as soon as possible. This, also, would explain the final desperation maneuver witnessed in cell phone video footage. In the end, you cannot blame the pilots. I consider myself a pretty good stick and rudder, and in the peril-free environment of a simulator, I was able to get it right 50% of the time. Pretty good odds in a casino, lousy in an airplane. In a surprise environment with a ton of uncertainty and mortal peril staring at you insufferably in the face, the best a pilot can do is save some lives, which is exactly what this crew did. God bless them. God bless the passengers. Until next time, stay safe.